have the privilege to welcome Peter Filkins to Poem Present today. I'm Phil Bowman from the music department and chair of Jewish Studies, and we're also pleased that Peter is with us this week. Tomorrow at 4:30 in this very room for the annual Gossett Lecture. You're all invited. He'll talk about some of his own translation work, and I guarantee that it will be an experience that you will be glad that you availed yourself of it. There are many reasons I take great pleasure in introducing Peter Filkins. He joins us this week for two special events. Today's reading at Poem Present, and tomorrow for the annual Gossett Lecture in the Arts of the Holocaust. There are many reasons I take great pleasure in introducing Peter Filkins. He brings a distinguished career as poet and translator to Chicago, with undergraduate studies at Williams College and graduate studies at Columbia University. His imagination and work have been supported by distinguished fellowships, a Fulbright at the University of Vienna from 1983 to 1985, most recently a Berlin Prize at the American Academy in Berlin. Since 1988, he has taught at Simon's Rock College of Bard. There are many reasons I take great pleasure in introducing Peter Filkins. His own published poetry has appeared widely, with two notable collections, What She Knew from 1998 and After Homer from 2002. The counterpoint, the Mehrstimmigkeit, or multiple voices, of his own poet's voice comes from the voices of others, whom he translates passionately, indeed passionately, in ways that a poet best translates. He gives voice, most notably, to the poetry of Ingeborg Bachmann in Songs in Flight from 1994, but now again in a new edition that has just appeared or is in the process of appearing. There are many reasons I take great pleasure in introducing Peter Filkins. In fact, my daughter, Andrea, had the pleasure of introducing him even before I had the pleasure, writing Peter's short biography for the Berlin Journal. There is special pleasure always gained by following in the footsteps of one's daughter. The father of two daughters, Peter knows this pleasure intimately himself. There are many reasons I take great pleasure in introducing Peter Filkins. He writes poetry whose texture is at once spare and dense with the presence of others, those voices, that Mehrstimmigkeit, which invite us to listen with him, even to interweave our voices with those of others. In so many of his poems, we are struck by his unselfishness, for these are poems about self and others, those who went before and who go before us now. How richly the simplest melody of each individual line, Homer's epic, Aretha Franklin's timeless song, finds its way into the richest chorus. There are many reasons I take great pleasure in introducing Peter Filkins. My musician's conceit gives me pleasure, for Peter's is a poetry of music. Music is a metaphor in his poetry. With music, his poetry sings from the pages. Music and poetry join, again through the unselfishness and unotherness of a poet and translator and father. There are many reasons I take great pleasure in introducing Peter Filkins.
Thank you, Phil, for that very intelligent, perceptive, and very, very generous introduction. There are many reasons I'm glad to be here at Chicago. I think back fondly to meeting Phil's daughter, Andrea, at the American Academy in Berlin. One of the other fellows there, Mason Bates, and on the second night we were there, I got tickets to an Ernst Toch concert at the Konzerthaus. And Andrea came with us and shared with me the secrets at how to score last-minute Berlin Philharmonic tickets. And you don't know how valuable this is when you're in Berlin. And if any of you are going to Berlin, I will share those secrets with you for a cool 50 at any stage. It's really quite difficult. But I very much enjoyed getting to know Andrea and her love of music, and then later on Phil when he was there visiting. And I deeply appreciate the invitation to be here to be sharing some poems and a little bit of translation today as well. And then tomorrow talking about an unknown writer by the name of H.G. Adler, who I'm quite passionate about. Not even the Germans know about him, but we're trying to change that, and something I'm very interested in. I know it's generally a common practice in the Poem Present series to do a lecture and then do a poetry reading. I also want to thank Julia Klein and for all of her help in organizing the reading. And Julia informed me at one stage it's common to do a lecture and then a poetry reading. Because of the gossip lecture, which I'm doing tonight, that wasn't going to be possible because that's on a different subject. So what I thought I'd do today, this afternoon, is to kind of combine the two, not a lecture, but a kind of talk, and to sort of read some poems and to share with you what I think I'm trying to do, what interests me while I'm writing, what I'm trying to accomplish in my writing. I was very moved by Phil's talking about being more interested in others than myself. And it's not because I'm a particularly selfless or nice guy or anything like that, but it just happens to be how I go about this. If I were to choose one subject that I'm most interested in, I think it's history. It's always been my favorite subject. I was not a history major or anything like that, but even as a boy, it was my favorite kind of reading, was to read about others. And of course, by reading about others, we're really trying to read about ourselves, and all of the great deal of traveling that I've been fortunate to be able to do. Translation has given me those opportunities, and I've always said when you live in another culture, you learn something about that culture, but you really are learning about this culture, and when you return home, and that which you carry with you everywhere you go. And that's my sense in poetry. Let me just begin with a poem that I think reflects that, or how that kind of happens for me, how I find myself sort of turning towards history. A few years ago, I was at the MacDowell Colony in the house where Porgy and Bess was written, actually, and that sort of sets your skin aflutter when you first walk in the door and realize that's what happened in that house. And nonetheless, it's a beautiful little house, not a cabin really, which sits right along a road. And I was at my desk working. This was in the wintertime in January, 10 degrees below, freezing cold. And I look up and look out the window, and here's a fellow running down the street, jogging, at 8 o'clock in the morning. And when you're lost in writing and poetry, things suddenly seem very odd to you. And I just sort of said, why is this guy running? This is 10 below up. He must be crazy. And this poem eventually worked itself out. And you'll see, I think, how history comes into it. Man running. Outside my window, a man running. Though it's midwinter, 10 above, he stays the course, determined to shed those Xmas pounds, lop off another tick from his last 10K, or better yet, live another year or two, provided, come what may, isn't a skidding car or cancer. Focused, head down, pumping fists, worry washes off him with his sweat. Though God may be dead, fitness has replaced him, as millions bent on lower heart rates like acolytes to Rome take to their morning run, a daily sacrifice for the lithe, sure ease of a country they call health. Meanwhile, I think of Verdun. Men, boys really, gone over the top, and through jagged wire to run forever and a mile, never to stop, or know, or breathe the scent of pine. fresh fallen snow, or see the expanse of sunlight arrested by an icy road on which we've been running ever since. I think it's a fair description of what often happens in the poems, or even life. I find myself looking at present reality and sort of shifting to a historical reality. Often, it has, in the last couple of years, it seems to be something attached to World War I, which kind of fascinates me, much more than World War II, although that of late has come more to the forefront. This is a poem called The Manifest, and it has to deal with the manifest of the RMS Lusitania, which sank in 1915. It has always been a debate as to whether or not the Lusitania was actually a weapons ship disguised as a passenger ship. And that's the reason, and the Germans knew this, and that's the reason that the German U-boats sank the Lusitania at the cost of 1,500 lives just off the coast of southern Ireland in 1915. The manifest is that piece of paper which lists all the goods in a ship's or an airplane's hold. It's the last thing that goes onto a boat or an airplane, cargo plane, before it leaves port. And there's one copy in the port and one copy on the vessel. And obviously the copy of the Lusitania, on the Lusitania, was lost with Lusitania. And the copy that was in New York before it left disappeared for many, many years and was found in FDR's papers many years after his death. And this poem deals with the manifest of the Lusitania. And these are all facts taken from the manifest, from a book by Colin Simpson called The Lusitania. The Manifest. When the great ship sailed, no one could know that Mrs. Matthews would win the ladies' potato race. The ribbon later found on the body of her husband, washed up on the rocks off the old head of Kinsale, which Captain Turner used as a landmark to verify his position, knowing, perhaps not knowing, about the peroxylin in the hold. I should explain that peroxylin is a gunpowder that when it gets wet becomes very explosive. About the peroxylin in the hold, the type of gun cotton that's highly explosive when immersed in seawater, though allegedly disguised as 3,863 boxes of cheese, each weighing a shade over 40 pounds, and listed on the manifest, franked by the Collector of Customs, Dudley Malone, appointed by Woodrow Wilson, who, when he heard the news, stepped into the rose garden, wept silently, then played a round of golf. The manifest later delivered to him and sealed, disappearing until it was found in FDR's papers, nearly 3 years after the death of Junior Third Officer Albert Bestick in 1969, the last man to see Alfred Vanderbilt alive and calmly tying life jackets onto wicker baskets of babies asleep after lunch in the nursery, as Carl Frohman quoted from Peter Pan, saying, "Why fear death? It's the most beautiful adventure in life." Before a great rush of water sent Bestick over the rail and into the sea, himself unable to find the strength to untie his life jacket and let himself drown, while he listened to the wails of the babies, ceasing one by one over the next 18 minutes, surprised to find the water so warm, the ship sinking fast, as Captain Schwieger looked on through a periscope, the funnels releasing huge belches of steam, the bulkheads flooded, the boiler rooms gone the way of the shattered lifeboats, the barrels of oysters, sides of beef, cases of knitted goods, barrels of brass, the boxes of candy, tubs of butter, copper ingots, non-explosive shrapnel, and 3,863 boxes of cheese, listed on the manifest that soon would disappear, the country gone to war, Albert Bestick hearing for decades the sound of those babies until the stroke that would kill him, emptying out the cargo of his memory, the haunted vessels of his mind. history doesn't take place on always a grand stage, and it doesn't always take place, as we know, in obvious ways, nor does it take place even in historical ways for historical figures, I guess. This is a poem called The Death of Chekhov, and it's again taken from a biography of Chekhov, all of the details from it. I think it sort of explains itself. When Chekhov knew there was no longer any hope, his body shot, his lungs reduced to bloody rags, he cried, "Ich sterbe," to his German doctor, who did the only sensible thing he could think of, and ordered champagne. Slowly, the glass emptied, Olga looking on, Chekhov's wife. A large black-winged moth battered a smoky lampshade, the evening sultry in Badenweiler, yet another spa promising cure. "It's been so long since I've had champagne," whispered Chekhov, as the moth slid out a window. Another bottle popped its cork, and the great writer turned on his side and soon ceased breathing. There were no human voices, no everyday sounds. There was only beauty, peace, the grandeur of death, Olga later reported, sitting up the whole night through to study her husband's face, now serene and knowing. Later that day, the usual arrangements were made. The body transported by train back to Moscow, a huge crowd there to greet it, a dirty green van marked Oysters, having brought it from the station. Which is to say nothing of Gorky's sense of outrage at such vulgarity, or that the crowd mistakenly followed the coffin of a General Keller, killed in Manchuria, thinking a military band seemed right for the occasion, as two lawyers debated the intelligence of their dogs. A woman with a parasol smiled at the constable, and Chekhov's mother pronounced his only eulogy. "What a calamity has struck us, and Tosha is no more." I think part of my reason for being interested in history is because I've always felt I've kind of lived in it. I live in Western Massachusetts and have my entire life in the Berkshires, and my family has for over 200 years, which is very, very unusual for Americans. And we're not blue bloods or anything like that whatsoever. We're working class, sort of upper working class at best. So I have this strong sense of roots and place, and there's a lot of history around us in Western Massachusetts, or even Massachusetts as a whole. And sometimes you find it just sort of walking through the fields. This is called an old New England graveyard, and quite often you'll be walking out in the woods or the fields, and you just come upon a graveyard, which seems to be, there's no town, there's no village. It's just in the middle of nowhere, and the town or the village or the hamlet that was once there is long gone. But for some reason, the graveyard still is, and usually in pretty good shape. You can read the names, and it's usually tended in some way, shape, or form. An old New England graveyard. At the field's far end, down by the dredged and roaring stream, past alleys of long light reaching through windbreak, maple, and beech, to scrape an old barn ruddy despite its sagging loft, he finds them. Headstones and their heavings, those we label forgotten and ignored, as if we could forget them, the dead and all their trappings. Listless, historical, bored, no doubt they do not mind the gate's low groan when opened by the odd man out in spring, who, there among the weeds, the names, the graven phrase or two, might find himself reduced to those low whispers of Gardner, Doty, Nash, or, considering the past, hears in his own heart's knocking the windy present beat, takes measure of the stones, makes note of their mossy touch, straddles the tufted grass, closes the gate, and goes home. It's a poem that that's the funny part. I kind of don't sit down and, if historical events happen in the present, I don't sit down and say, oh, well, this is sort of made for me. I write poems about history. I'll do that. But this is one of the few exceptions to that. This was the 1992 Gulf War, Iraq War, the first one. I remember coming home, and this was the first time we came home and turned on CNN and watched precision bombs go into buildings. And this was sort of the evening's, quote, entertainment. And it was quite shocking. People talk about Vietnam being the first television war. Well, in some ways, the first Iraq war was the real television war. I mean, it was just the real video war. There weren't people. There weren't bodies. You just sort of saw these implosions and could sort of hear the patriotic roar in the background. It was kind of very disturbing, and it gave rise to this poem called Dominion. Dominion ranges a blouse's perfect pleat, sets ice to groaning on a frozen lake, shifts the fire log, the tectonic plate, topples the card house into a heaped mistake. And our Dominion, each whirring, well-lit home oiled by earth and seabed, the constructed heaven the bank claims that you own? Think of the bomb dropped on a blacked-out city, film at 11, the little crucifixion of a missile's sights. Then watch it set off the beautiful implosion two lovers might feel beneath ecstatic rubble. Think of the desert, moonless, the map's gridiron, the coordinates a soldier marks on fishnet thighs. Then count your lucky stars, count your troubles. Sometimes you write a poem and history takes it over. Or sometimes history takes over a work of art. Deutschland, Haydn's Deutschland, Deutschland, right, is the great example of that. This is written long before 9/11, but I think just has an unmistakable kind of echo with that, as do many works of art. I'm not special in that. That's art's job. It puts its ear to the ground and can hear things that not even the makers know that they're hearing at the time. It's called Anthem for the Victims. I would have saved them if I could, but I didn't know. I wasn't there. The time wasn't right, conditions not good. Something somewhere got misunderstood. We'll never know just when or where. I would have saved them if I could. Living here in this neighborhood, it's hard to imagine. It seems unfair. The time wasn't right, conditions not good. But that's no excuse. Someone should have had the decency to care. I would have saved them if I could. Of that I'm sure, but knock on wood, it ain't me or you that's lying there. The time wasn't right, conditions not good. But are they ever? I wish they would stop all this talk of who, what, where. I would have saved them if I could. The time wasn't right, conditions not good. I've come to recognize that my work as a translator, too, has had this sort of historical interface, primarily through Ingeborg Bachmann, who is an Austrian poet born in 1926, died in 1973 at the age of 47 in a fire in her Rome apartment. She spent World War II as a young girl and then as a university student, and then really came to the forefront in the 1950s along with Paul Celan, who's a very good friend of hers. And she and Celan would be considered the sort of two premier poets of the post-war generation. I've been working on Bachmann's poems for 25 years now, and a new collection, a new edition of her collected poems is about to appear from Zephyr Press. I'm supposed to get my first copy when I get off the plane at home, so I'm quite excited about this. But it will be out officially in June, but should be starting to hit the bookstores pretty soon. And so I thought I'd share a couple of these with you, since this is really sort of the imminent publication to be coming out. This is a poem called Early Noon, and you'll hear Bachmann talk about Germany But what you'll hear buried in the poem are echoes of Goethe and Die Winterreise and Schubert. 7 years later, it occurs to you again. These are lines from Die Winterreise. But this poem is written in 1952. Count back 7 years, 1945. She's talking about the end of the war, the aftermath. The henchmen of Germany who were running the bureaucracy of the Nazi regime, but many, of course, were actually still needed and in power on the level of judges and bureaucrats and finance people and bankers and things like that. And it took a very long time to sort this out. And Bachmann was a voice outraged by this injustice after the war. It's a poem called Early Noon. Silently the linden greens in incipient summer. Far from the cities there glimmers the pale brightness of the day moon. Already it's noon. Already a sunbeam flashes in the fountain. Already the fabulous bird's flayed wing lifts itself beneath the rubble. And the hand that's cramped from casting stones sinks into the budding wheat. Where Germany's sky blackens the earth, its beheaded angel seeks a grave for hate and offers you the bowl of the heart. A handful of pain vanishes over the hill. 7 years later, it occurs to you again. At the fountain before the portal, don't look too deep within as your eyes fill with tears. 7 years later, inside a mortuary, the hangman of yesterday drained the golden cup. Your eyes lower in shame. Already it's noon. In embers the iron bends. On the thorn the flag is hoisted, and onto the cliff of the ancient dream the eagle is welded, remaining forever. Only hope cowers, blinded in the light. Throw off its shackles, help it down the slope, cover its eyes so that the short shadows don't scorch it. Where Germany's earth blackens the sky, a cloud seeks words and fills the crater with silence before summer hears them in the patter of rain. The unspeakable passes, barely spoken, over the land. Already it's noon. That line, the unspeakable passes, barely spoken over the land, of course works in dual ways. The way that the unspeakable violence of history is not spoken often. It's the struggle of history to have the violence of history come into the open daylight, especially after a great cataclysm like World War II or the Holocaust. And at the same time, it's the voice of poetry, right? In other words, the voice of poetry which is trying to speak the ineffable and to speak the unspoken. So it's always a dual nature in Bachmann between despair and hope always kind of just barely wins out in the end. Why? Primarily because of language. It's a poem called Exile. I am a dead man, and it's a man, very clearly in German. It's very interesting. Bachmann will often write in the voice of a man, and she does this in her later fiction. I am a dead man who wanders registered nowhere, unknown in the prefect's realm, unaccounted for in the golden cities and the greening land, long since given up and provided with nothing, only with wind, with time, and with sound. I, who cannot live among humans. I, with the German language, this cloud around me, which I keep as a house, pressed through all languages. Oh, how it grows dark, those muted, those rain tones. Only a few fall. Into brighter zones, it will lift the dead man up. When you translate this poem, you get to, or even read it, you get to the bottom and say, it will lift the dead man up. What is the it? In the German, you trace it back, and because of the gendered nature of the articles of German, you sort of do this kind of treasure hunt back through the poem, looking for a feminine singular noun, and the only one is die deutsche Sprache, and it's die deutsche Sprache, which will lift the dead man up, or language itself, die Sprache itself. And I think that it's my attraction. It's part of that musicality that Phil was referring to in his introduction. It's the music of a poem that will always get me going first. I describe it as a piece of language will occur to me. And I use the word piece very consciously. It almost has a concrete three-dimensional feel to me. And I don't quite understand it, and that's not to be mysterious or mystifying. It's a subject and a music that will begin to suggest itself, and then my job is to try and exhaust the possibilities of that and see if something will work. Into brighter zones, it will lift the dead man up. Well, sometimes the dead man is a very real man, and sometimes we use language to try to lift the dead man up through elegy, and that's the purpose of elegy. This is one to my father, who died in 1998. Actually, I decided to share this with you. I switched planes coming out here and found myself on flight 1127 on United, and apparently they have this sub-company called TED, and it has big TED right on the side of the planes. Well, 1127 is my daughter's birthday, my twin daughter's birthday, November 27th. My father's name was Ted, and I thought, well, this is going to be a good day. I mean, this is, poets sort of notice things like that. And in fact, on the day of my father's funeral, we were burying him in the town that he grew up in, that I grew up in, and sirens went off down the road while the ceremony was going on. And the next morning, I got up and read the paper he read all his life, and I've read all my life, and a boy had drowned in what's called Wacona Falls, which is a falls just up the road, and it's where my father learned how to swim. And a boy had, so at the very moment we were burying my father, this young boy had drowned in these falls, and suddenly again the music of the poem just sort of came to me. And this is while I was weeding the garden the next day. I think that shows up in the first line, which at the time I was too dumb to recognize where it came from, but here it goes. In lieu of flowers, we stuck my father in the ground. The day was hot, the sun shone. Shadows piled up in little mounds. Up the road, a boy had drowned in rocky falls, swimming alone. We stuck my father in the ground, continued grieving, as divers found something made of flesh and bone. Shadows piled up in little mounds. The sun now high, the only sound a siren's far-off wailing moan. We stuck my father in the ground and said goodbye, his soul now bound for regions the boy could not have known, as shadows piled up in little mounds of earth, of water, currents that wound their way down through the massive stones, spilling my father into the ground, as shadows piled up in little mounds. A few years ago, I was in a doctor's office and reading the local paper, the real local paper called The Advocate. This is the village rag sheet, right? This is where you get all the good stuff. That's where you get all the gossip in places like Western Massachusetts. And I read that this woman, Patricia Buckley, had died. And I had known Patricia, but she died at 69, born in 1927 and died in 1997. I had known her by teaching a winter study course at Williams, actually, and it was a multi-section course, and she taught one of the sections. And she was from Australia, and a perfectly delightful human being who had done nothing exceptional in her life that would demand the writing of an elegy. In other words, and I'm not saying anything negative about her. She had raised a family. She had worked as a secretary at the UN for many years, was very excited about that, had earned a master's degree over several summers at the Middlebury English School, and finally had, in her retirement, had a chance to teach one of these sections of this course at Williams, and was extremely steeped in literature, and just an absolutely delightful person who I just liked. And it was one of those things, I was sitting in the doctor's office reading the Village Rag and seeing that we were not close enough for me to have known that no one would have called me up and said, Pat died or anything like that. And it's when you see an obituary and you go, oh, just sort of, oh my dear, oh my gosh, what a shame, that's terrible. And it suddenly occurred to me, how do you pay homage to that? In other words, if we're talking about history, that too is history. How can you take that little reaction of, oh my gosh, and make that, I mean, why wouldn't you want to, right? I mean, there's some of the most genuine feelings that we have. And so this took me a number of years. It's simply called Passing Elegy. Gentle, kind, somewhat nondescript, words describing you seem almost, Pat, following the oh my God that slips out suddenly in the empty waiting room, itself testament enough, involuntary, apt to raise no tear or unnecessary gloom among the coats and hats, the silken flowers. And yet I knew you, liked your graceful wit, your swimming Aussie charm so out of place in New England's chill reserve. Even your obit is reticent, forgotten in the heap of money, life, and time, as if embarrassed by the piped-in music, the battered, cheap, fluorescent light, like so much influenza. Stranded here, nursing an aching back in ice-bound winter, I hear the seconds tick their sleet against the punctuated black of this homey tomb's each frozen window pane, where, midwinter, 5:30, even the air seems sick for a field in summer, the plaintive sweet refrain in some lofty elm of a Phoebe's falling trochee, being, right now, the memory that is you, dignified, calm, mentioning a little cancer, the last we talked, as if you'd just come through a bout with shingles, minor renovations, or no more than a spell of lousy weather. Little did I know your shy hesitation terminal as well, your smile but certain knowledge the end of something was near, be it a life or more, whatever devotion without motive is worth these days, yourself the working wife who left no lasting mark, no monument or tome beyond a belief in words as a means to live, husband, children, grandkids, house and home, sublimations of a grace that was your second nature. God rest you, Pat. God save my ailing back and set me free from this den of dusty palms, where, despite the bitter cold, it's the lack of you that's most acute, and nothing for it but this, my passing elegy, the inverted alms of one whose life's the poorer without your spirit, intelligent and charitable, anonymous and gone. I'm not this really depressive fellow who sits around thinking about history, so this is a bit more fun. It's a poem called Beet Weeding. And often people who've read this poem will say something like, oh, I like your poem Beet Wedding. And I don't correct them. And you'll see, my wife and I tending a garden. And I don't know if you have planted beets, and this will be coming up in a few weeks' time. You plant beets, and then you have to go through and pull out every second one after a couple of weeks. So they're about 2 inches high, the green. And because otherwise there's no room for the beets to actually grow. There's no reason. You just go through and you pluck out every second one of healthy plants. And it struck me as just sort of, really cruel. I mean, they haven't done anything wrong. They're healthy and green. They're doing what the other ones are supposed to doing, but they got to go. So, and she's the one who instructed me on this in her greater wisdom. Beet weeding. Why don't you weed the beets, she said, suggesting that I leave her to the spinach on her own so she could finish, maybe work on dinner. Besides, you're still a learner, she slyly added, prodding my backside with the hoe's blunt handle. Both of us knowing as she turned and left me to liberate the beets from their lowly weeddom, my gardening know-how so much less than hers. How right she was, I soon discovered. Myself, a novice fool who thought that kneeling down with each June beet like any squash or sprout, and combing one by one would turn our patch into an open, ordered plain, an army on the march, with all that tussling green like some crusade sent headlong row by row into the teeth of August. Silly, she said, you've got to weed them out, not just spruce up the bed like some showpiece for Gardener's Monthly. Look at the package, as she advised and read, pointing a muddy finger. When plants are 5 to 6 inches tall, remove each second one, preferably the weaker sort, in order that enough space lies between, about 4 inches, for rest to thrive and grow. 'Cause if you don't, we'll have no beets at all, but just a heap of crowded bitter greens. I simply didn't know, as she went off across the yard and in to clang, chop, boil, and sizzle at our dinner, that gardening could come down to this. One beet condemned because too close for comfort to a neighbor, while all the guides so calmly wrote, the best means to avoid attrition, saves space, and guarantees a crop as well. As if some beet might nod approval, quiver, shake, then see the common good. Like some thick god, I bent and worked alone as evening fell across the hillside, field, and river, then heard her call and saw her wave me in to quit, wash up, help her set the table. Lesson learned? She asked, and smiled, arranging the flowers, plates, and silver, as I sat down, beet-dazed and weary, and told her that I loved her. Relationships, marriages go through histories, changes as well, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. This is a poem called In Weather. My wife and I lived for a few years in a converted sheep barn, which was fantastic. It was lovely. And it was this 18th century sheep barn which had hand-chiseled beams, which creaked a lot, especially in winter, especially when there was snow on the roof. In Weather. Love is the answer we give back, waking to snowfields frozen blue. Weight-bearing beams expand, contract. A mottled sky, our almanac, promises cold for a month or two. Love is the answer we give back. Until the dusk, the light gone slack, the troubled wind in the chimneys flew. Weight-bearing beams expand, contract, threatening to give, begin to crack, causing the china to sit askew. Love is the answer we give back. Later at night in the wintry black, you still love me, I still love you. Weight-bearing beams expand, contract. Together in bed, lying back to back, what warmth there is we feel as two. Love is the answer we give back. Weight-bearing beams expand, contract. And sort of the third of those poems, called The Hunters. I live on a lake, and each falls we have the annual arrival of the duck hunters, who show up one morning about 5 a.m. And start blasting away and never seem to hit anything. I don't know why they come there or what they think they're doing. This is called The Hunters. I have nothing against hunting. I just have something against bad hunters, I think. That's, noisy ones. Dawn's tender light erupts with a blast of shotguns on the lake, jolting us awake from our halting sleep. The hunters are back, predictable as fall's bright, bloody wash of dying maples. camouflaged, funereal in their whispered deathbed watch behind a makeshift blind. Their fitful quack-ack-acks imitate the call of a wounded duck that in fact sounds drunk. Each belching shot an attempt at validation that ends in failure. Dearest, the blaze of morning is upon us, here in our downy bed. Come closer, let's kiss. Whatever's insinuated by the chuck of water, far fields of sun-blanched hay, may it be this sweet tribulation of lips and arms and breasts under the snug duvet you lift like a vaulted wing, our bodies warm as the rose light firing the hills of this furious season. And it seems we're always living in a furious season of many different shapes and kinds. This is a childhood memory, not really, it's an adult memory of a childhood friend who came to great tragedy. And I found out after the fact, and that always sort of makes it worse because you're not there to deal with it. Simply called Rocky, who's my next door neighbor. That's my boyhood friend who, like many childhood friends, we drifted apart, lost touch with each other later in life. As the fastball released, spinning and spitting to slide invincibly low and away, how could I know? The umpire calling me out, out went the roar of the crowd into the dusky air. Years later, blear-eyed mad, with immaculate grief, he'd place the gun in his mouth, think twice about the shame he'd leave behind. Misery, however, triumphing quickly over the future, blank empty of her touch, her smile, now no more than heartsick, bitter flame, triggering the disastrous inner explosion of a life gone to pieces. Rocky, Rocky, his father bellowed from the back door steps as we played on and on in the sandlot, practicing the useless, beautiful skills of our little league. Pop fly and grounder, toss and catch. There in the low red glare of a late innings summer's sunset, that, come Saturday, would freeze my stance, blind me to the pitch. I never saw it coming. It's actually what happened when I heard about this poor fellow's terrible tragedy. I remember him, I'm 9 years old. I remember playing Little League against this guy and him releasing a fastball that I just absolutely froze me in my tracks. And why the news of such a horrible death would make you think of an image like that was what immediately attracted me to the poem. Let me just finish with 2 more poems and then perhaps take some questions. I don't want to go on too long on this beautiful day, which there's still a couple hours of nice sunlight. One of the other solaces for me beyond history, though I like to link the two of late, is painting and art, which has meant a great deal to me. And I was at the Art Institute this afternoon looking at some of Monet's water lilies, which of course were painted in basically 1900 to 2022. But the real breakthrough was during the World War I, that Monet was outside of Paris with the trenches only miles away. I mean, he must have been able to hear the pounding, the bombardment. And Monet spends the war years painting water lilies as an 80-year-old man, in the last great triumph of his life. Water lilies. Meanwhile, he painted them. Water lilies, floating on the surface of a pond he'd constructed for the pleasure of the eye and motifs to paint at century's end. The new one begun with multiple explosions of red, of pink, white, fleshy flowers against the backdrop of a subsurface blue with distances. The sky itself, reflected in the watery calm, where a cloud adrift would later be captured by his brush in motion, Each day in the studio, another one spent to the echo of guns bombarding the trenches, pummeling the sun, erupting in billows of acrid black smoke upon a horizon no longer present but subsumed, erased, immersed as he was in the fusion of light and water, flowers afloat on the air beneath a willow and its weeping, our only perspective in a lost world lost to bottomless translucency, the eye that sees it, and the intractable sun. And finally, perhaps after so many poems of this world, a poem simply titled Another Life. Another life floats on the wind outside my window, a storm advancing on tall bent trees, where children run at sunset across the new-mown grass as the sky shifts pink to gray in the painting of a woman who stands naked in a room, nothing before her but the immediate city, and just beyond, what she knew was sky, was open sea. Thank you very much.